Welcome to the Probability Podcast. Discussions on emerging and converging technologies, problems that are being solved, and the probability of positive and negative outcomes that we might expect. Now, please welcome your hosts, Jason, the generator Spracklin, and Patrick, the discriminator Lozon.
Hey everyone, the topic for this week is AI reasoning models. Reasoning is at the core of how humans process information, make decisions, and solve problems. But what happens when we try to replicate these reasoning systems in AI? In today's episode, we'll explore how cutting-edge AI models are designed to mirror human reasoning principles like deduction, induction, and even abductive logic. We'll discuss how neural symbolic AI blends structured logic with adaptive learning, and how probabilistic models handle uncertainty, and how analogical reasoning allows AI to learn from past experiences. As we unpack these advanced systems, we'll also examine their limitations. Can AI truly emulate human creativity, emotional intelligence, or moral reasoning? Or are these systems designed to remain tools rather than thinkers? Join us as we explore whether AI reasoning can ever match the depth and nuance of human thought, and what that means for the future of technology and society. So, Patrick, do you know why we're alive?
Well, we're alive to appreciate what is around us. How's that for an answer?
That sounds good to me.
Appreciate our reality. Yeah. It's funny, when we first started talking about reasoning and how AI actually goes through the process of reasoning through topics. It's pretty difficult premise, right? Because when you think about how do we think, right? So, I think that's the first thing we should do is let's step back and talk about the tenets or the principles that we use, right? When we actually try to reason problems up, try to deduce answers, right? Or at least kind of build up some kind of a solution to a problem, right? So that all being said, first off, we've got a few principles we've got to cover. Whatever the subject is what the subject is. Like there's a understanding of what that thing is, right? What the definition of that thing. And if we try to solve a problem, but we don't understand what the thing is we're trying to either solve or the subjects that are involved, we're not going to do a very good job. So that's the
we
first
need to
thing.
Contextualize it, right?
Yeah, for
essentially,
sure.
And that's I think the next evolution that's happened in these sort of AI models, right? These large language models were originally put together and trained on a large set of information or data, right? And then really it was the way it would give an answer was that it would recognize sort of patterns in that information. And based on what you asked, it would gather together things based on a pattern or on some sort of like connective tissue between things and kind of spit out an answer. But there wasn't any what they would call reasoning, right? It didn't think through the problem, and it didn't consider all the different context and then sit down and work through it the same way you would work through like answering a question on an exam in school. It would just simply recognize a pattern, spit something out, which, I mean, had its kind of use and certainly made these models kind of explode in popularity. But we quickly realized that it wasn't really going through any sort of process to ensure that the answer was factual or that it made logical sense or that it was contextual to the bigger picture of what you were asking, right? And that's really what we're talking about today, is that idea of like reasoning through an answer to ensure it's correct, I suppose.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, a good point to that is like, you think about a particular issue, right? Let's say you deal with miscarriages, right? And women aged 30 to 40 and in a specific area of the world. And you can tie that back to snails mating in Africa, and miscarriages go up when snails die or something, right? Now you have this correlation, right? But it's not root cause. It's not a entrenched or a relatable uh, correlation that makes sense. It's just a correlation. It's just a pattern, right? And this is where a lot of people get caught up when they're trying to solve problems. Is they get caught up in the correlation, not the actual root cause, right? And when we start thinking about working through a problem, right, AI would be off there, you know, spouting off these weird, wonderful patterns and not really coming to a root cause, right? And this is the challenge that we're trying to solve, right? We've got to steer the boat, so to speak, on the thought process.
Often there's a disconnect between correlation and causation, right? In that sometimes things can look like they're related, but it's just
But they're
more of
not.
a coincidence, right? It's not directly tied to why something comes to be, for example. Or, oftentimes when they look at a medical diagnosis, they might notice something and say, well, this there's a correlation to this, right? But you may be experiencing those symptoms for a completely unrelated reason, right? And it just so happens that these two things are happening at the same time, but the correlation and causation are completely different in that sense, right?
Yeah, it can be very difficult to actually isolate and resolve a problem. It's very complex because of what you just said, right? To be able to understand the data that you're looking at, right? And be able to break that down through a process that makes sense and not go down, the different paths that are in one way just a big waste of time, right? So you think about, ongoing with our process of applying human reasoning. Another thing is that that we put as a tenet or a principle of reasoning is that you can't have uh, contradictions, right? Things are the way they are, right? Um, and with that, the nature of things is how things will behave, and that goes back to the laws of physics and so on and so forth, and that's what you utilize when you're, and the idea is that um, if you start breaking those fundamental rules, you're going to come up with a bunch of crazy ideas, but they're not going to be the right ones, right? Um, there's another principle here um, where it's very simple. It's similar to contradictions that a proposition can be true or its negation can be true, but you can't have it both ways,
Hmm.
right? So it's very simple, straightforward, something like contradiction. These are very, we think about things like that and we don't give it we don't give it much thought. We just say, yeah, that's the nature of the universe kind of thing, right? Um,
But it's really
another,
like a test of the human brain and its ability to like work through a problem. You oftentimes run
yeah,
into these sort of um, cognitive type tests, right? When you're applying to a company, which we both had enough experiences,
yeah,
working through that, right? And they give you these problems that on the surface, you look at them sometimes, you think they're very simple in that they kind of read simple. But when you start actually trying to break it down and figure out what the right answer is, you realize, oh, there's actually some complexity here that I need to think through logically in my brain, which is again what these original LLM models were not doing. And I noticed, like, even when I'm using the ones with the reasoning model, it'll actually show me as it's working through, and it'll start breaking things down and how it like came to that conclusion. And then you can look back on that and have some reasonable assurity that okay, there's been some amount of reasoning there, right?
yeah. So when you think about um, the word reason, right? The idea is that it's uh, there's an expectancy of fundamental premise of thought, right? It's not it's not a idea of, just chaos, right? There's a process of elimination and fundamentals that are put in place, right? And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the tenets and the principles of reasoning, right?
Mm.
Another one is that there everything should have a reason, right? When certain things occur, there's a reason for it. There's a root cause, right? And, and when you start thinking about that, one of my favorite shows, it was Mayday, where they had a whole series of events occurred before the last event, which was the tragedy, right? But all those typical, events could have went many different ways, but
Hmm.
they all lined up, right? So, situation A, situation B, situation C, and they all had these root causes, right? And that led to, ultimately, you know, the plane crash, right? And that this is a principle of thought that yes, there's a logical, you know, process behind things occurring, and there's reasons behind those things. And if you understand the reasons behind what happened prior, you can actually deduct what's going to occur, right? So that's another principle. Um, and of course, the idea of being able to build out models and thought patterns and we'll call them challenges, right? Or you know, tests and be able to execute them and verify, right? What happens in those models, right? That's a reasonable step, right? To to get to a point where you can find root cause, right? So building those and testing those models and throwing out what assumptions were wrong, and isolating what other things have occurred that you didn't originally deduce, right? Um, and then we get into the deduce and inductive reasoning, which is, yeah, if this happens and that happens, then X will happen, right? I mean, Sherlock Holmes, all about deductive reasoning, right? You know, we start thinking about, inducive reasoning. The similar, it's a similar thing where, you look at what conclusions can be formed by the observations, right? Um, and that means that you are actually observing, you're measuring, you're taking samples, right? So these are active measures, right? Well, active or actions, I should say, that you're taking, which it makes sense that a AI really doesn't have the ability to perform actions and say we need to test this, and this, right? Um, they're not having to do that from a point of view of their models they're building, so they don't jump to that conclusion saying that we could be wrong, therefore we need to isolate and verify and basically shrink the sample set down, right? So
Hmm.
that is one of the last things that we got to consider too is the principles of thinking, right? And that really, our brains tend to break things down into, like, we talked about a lot of really interesting, subjects here in the beginning. We threw out some big terms, right? But we're really talking about thinking through an issue, right? We really break things down to their simplest forms and work through, the fundamentals of each one. And then from there, continue down that road to move to the next fundamental, right? And that is, that gets us to a point where we can say we're confident, right? And we actually can build a ladder to where we ended up, right? And that's that proof that we always talk about, right? That we're
Hmm.
looking for, right? So these are the main fundamentals, I guess, the principles of how we go through and reason through problems. right? Reason through to solutions. And with that in mind, right, we can look at that and say, okay, what, you know, where on the scale, right, is AI being able to do this, right? And that's an interesting question, because a lot of people feel
Hmm.
right now that they're not very effective at all, but with Gemini 2.5 and GPT-4, is it 4.0 or whatever, they're claiming we got these reasoning models now, and they can work through and actually arrive at a solution to a problem, and to do that in a manner that it's principled, has a process behind it, and is defendable.
Yeah, so is it fair to say that these models are sort of using these seven principles in a sense, or they've been programmed in that manner, right? Because it's the idea is that they're trying to make these models emulate the way a human brain thinks. So, by extrapolation of that, using my own problem solving here, I would deduce that they're using, the seven principles, for example, right? To kind of figure that out. And then my question would be, does this model have enough contextual understanding of the world around it and the history of things and other types of elements like cultural implications or what have you? Like, can it truly reason through something, or is it still again working through things through an information set in some sort of logical manner? I mean, I think it's definitely a step in the right direction that it's actually using a process to work through that problem, right? So I would imagine that that's probably, it feels like it's kind of like a stopgap between what we had with LLMs and where we might end up with AGI, right? Because with general intelligence, which we've covered in the past, is the idea that it's the basic definition is it has some sort of awareness of its place in the world and its surroundings and that type of thing. And so if we're programming it now to think and use the same principles that we use, then is it a stepping stone, right?
Yeah,
That'd be my big question.
yeah, and I think we're going to get to that. I got to throw one more layer of
Oh, here we go.
complexity onto this thing, of course, because we're pretty amazing beings, right? So the next level, really, if you take those principles and say, okay, that's how the brain kind of works through the symbologies and the thought process. Okay, that sort of makes sense. But then, you know, there's also this ability for us to, actually automatically or intuitively come to decisions on things, um, some things, and then other things we need to sit back and reflect, right, and come up with an answer.
Hmm.
So that is what they call dual processing theory, right? And the idea being that kind of that intuitive, automatic thing that we're able to do, um, just like muscle memory. We've got a whole bunch of information already pre-staged and stored and organized, and we can jump or leap to an answer automatically, right? And some of this is because we also tie in our emotions to these things, right? And we
True,
have
yeah.
an instinct, right? Everybody says, "Oh, you have good instincts," right? What does that mean, right? That means we can act on things quickly and actually be right. And you turn around and you say, "Well, how'd that person do that?" Well, they developed that instinct and working in that with those particular problems over time, right? And they see the patterns and they understand what the challenges are, and they can jump to the conclusion and take all these shortcuts, right? So that's kind of the first capability that we have, is the shortcut, the process, right?
Hmm.
And it all has to do with experience and transferable capabilities, where we see one particular set of issues and we can tie that back to something similar, all right, and be able to come up with a similar solution, right? So that's our first thing. The next thing, of course, is how we look at things and really analyze, right? And that's really, we'll call that a deliberate process, right? Where we actually take the time to focus. Now, we could all argue that nobody focuses on anything nowadays because we got to go look at our phone or check out the latest YouTube or, be distracted in some other manner. But, the idea here is that, yes, we should be taking time out to work through a problem, even, talk through problems with others, that kind of thing, but focus time, right? And actually work through a systematic approach, step by step, right? Evaluate just how likely, your answer is, how much risk is involved, how are, what are the fundamentals behind that, right? That's why we talk about the 7 principles, right? And of course, with that, that logical reasoning, some people are really strong at logical reasoning and some are not, right? Some really have, really strong capability for we'll call rules. They have rules. You follow the rules, right? And other people are a little less, right? Well, that's not necessarily a rule. We can bend that, right? And then you get into that, here's a problem, and now person comes through and with the rules, it comes up with a solution. It may not be the correct solution, but it came up faster with the answer. And you say, well, how'd that person do that? Whereas the other person who has many different possibilities and, trying to look at many different risks, is a little more stuck in the mud trying to solve the problem, right?
Yeah, but you could also conceive your own rationale to support, sort of the answer that you've come up with, right? That you could, theoretically say, well, I think this is true, so let me reason back how I might come to this conclusion, which is a little bit of a backwards way of thinking, right? But I saw this video online of this guy trying to explain his theory. He'd done his own research, by the way, that the Earth does not rotate. And his reasoning, it's making me laugh just thinking about it.
Okay.
His reasoning was that, and I don't see in any situation how this could possibly be a logical train of thought, but this guy legitimately said that if you took a helicopter and you brought it up in the air and you had hover for 24 hours, and then you brought it back down, you would land in the same spot that you took off in. So I don't know if you want to reason through how that could possibly be. I mean, we all know the Earth rotates because of day and night and seasons and all these peculiar things that we've experienced through our whole life. But somehow this guy came up with this reasoning. I'm sure he didn't actually bring a helicopter in the air, but somehow that was his rationale for his belief in why the Earth doesn't rotate. Why that was important to him, I'm not entirely sure, but there you go.
Well, that's great because it is. I mean, everybody, the Earth is. I mean, the universe rotates around you, Jason. We all know that, right?
Well, I like to think so.
Yeah. Well, it rotates around everybody, right? Because really, you're the point of consciousness, right? And it got everybody else around you, of course. But when it comes to your life, you're the point of consciousness. So things happen around you, right? And you're going to make assumptions around how things, just like we talked about the correlations, how things work, right? Based on what you see and what you observe, what you measure, right? Now, clearly you have to understand things when it comes to that helicopter, that what does hovering mean, right? Because is hovering really mean that the pilot is ensuring that the helicopter is staying above that spot or not? And that all being said, when you think about the ideas around, reasoning through a problem, you have to build up that huge arbitrage, a collection of knowledge that you pull from. And, there's going to be gaps there. There's going to be dichotomies, things that don't quite make sense, blurriness in the vision, so to speak, right? And you have to work through that and come out the other end with some sort of answer. So we are fundamentally working in a world of imprecision, right? Unless you're a mathematician, right? We every day we work in a world of imprecision. Things don't uh, we don't understand how nature of how everything works, and we don't understand the specifics around every component of every piece of every piece of machinery that is involved in a particular problem, so to speak, and
Hmm.
how what its outcome is going to be. We're always going to take a leap on what we know, what we've seen, and that means that we're going to fill in those gaps with what we understand.
Or have other people fill them in for us, right? And we don't need to get into the whole misinformation, conversation in this podcast. But we've covered we've covered the whole misinformation thing quite
Yeah,
a bit, right?
yeah, yeah,
But by that I mean that if you're trying to reason, why something may be true, and somewhere along the way you've been fed a bunch of things that are a bunch of ideas that are fundamentally not true, but they back up, or they justify how you're thinking or the information that you have or what you're trying to believe, is true or false, then that can be manipulated to an extent, right?
yeah,
Um, and then people can, and then oftentimes, they will latch on to things because it supports that belief or that conclusion. For example, right? There's a quote from a book I read a long time ago about that people can believe anything, either because they want it to be true or because they're afraid it is true. And so that they'll, sort of concoct whatever reasoning or justification around that to sort of so that they feel good about their sort of belief in something, right?
yeah. And we all know Sasquatch is real. We know that. We just put it out there, right? He's out
Yeah, if
there.
we start working through it, though, I mean, we could come
Yeah,
up with all kinds of logic and correlation and causation and how a Sasquatch could come to be, right?
that's right.
I
Yeah,
mean, it's
and we could
entirely
spend all
possible,
day.
right?
We could spend this whole podcast talking about the Sasquatch, but we're not going to. You know,
Hey, we'll
um,
save that for a future episode.
that's right. Yeah. So when we start thinking about, the process, right? We always go back to the similarities, what we've seen before, right? And the ability to go and tie these things, these comparatives together, right? And with that, sure, we can work at a level of generality as well, right?
Hmm.
Um, but that means that also this is a level of complexity that human beings can do, right? That ability to work in the gray area. Now, we don't have access to all the vast amounts of information that, AI has that has actually been proven and then documented, provided, I will say provided, that information was put in was the accurate information. I'll go there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. If they put it, the contrary and inaccurate information is put into the AI, and that's what the AI understands, it's going to come up with, you know, invalid, you know, answers, right?
Garbage in, garbage out, right?
Garbage in, garbage out. Yeah. So that's that. So going back to the complexity conversation, we're asking a machine that works in computation, ones and zeros kind of thing, to come up with the between one and zero answers, right? We want them to come up with these leaps, these fill in these gaps, and work in the gray area, so to speak. And that's what we're really looking for in the on the reasoning side, right? Where you have missing information, you're able to work past that. and still come up with something reasonable, right? So if you rely on, you go to GPT-4o and you say, I'm trying to do a strategy to move into this market, right? And I need to build a business case for that, and you want to give it as much context, much information as you can, and you want it to, formulate a business plan and put together a list of, comprehensive strategies and approaches and tactics and all that to accomplish what you're trying to do. But it can't necessarily go to that level because of the fundamental gray area problem, right? Yeah. So we have all the same problems that an AI has, but we also have some added capabilities, and they're trying to make AI make that leap, right? So if you think about, the idea of how we do that, right? That was really getting into, what we'll call human cognition, right? And how we understand things, and how our memory works, and how we pull upon that to fill in the patterns, right, that are missing, right? And with that, we generate an answer. It may not be a perfect answer, but it's an answer. And so, yes, we're getting chased by the proverbial, giant cat, and we we have a challenge here of taking trail B or trail A, and we choose trail A and we survive, right?
Yeah, but the funny thing is that not everything can also be purely based on logic either, for example, right?
Yeah.
That there are some things that are sort of, we come to some conclusions based on like theoretical reasoning even, right? I mean, that's how we come to answers in science sometimes, because there are sometimes things that can't be directly observed or explained, for example, right? In that you have to sort of take a bit of I guess like a leap of faith or what have you, right? That you have to kind of work through something and you have to theorize, right? If this is true, then maybe this could be true, or there's a missing piece in something that you have to sort of fill in through your own sort of I guess like imagination or what
You
have
mean
you, right?
quasi particles?
Yeah. You have to sort of like
Yeah.
take a quantum leap, as it were, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
and sometimes you have to like color outside the boundaries of like what may be considered logical, right? There's a famous quote that I don't know how famous it is. It's famous in my mind, back to our own little microcosm of a world that we all live in. But there was a quote that said, "All progress is a leap in the dark. It's an unpremeditated act of faith, right? That it's like it's an interesting concept in a sense, right? In that if you only ever rely on what's perfectly logical and known, and you don't at some point make a leap of faith, then you're not going to really make progress and kind of like smash to the next boundary, right? So if it wasn't for people taking that leap into the darkness, we wouldn't have, quantum chips, and we wouldn't have AI maybe, right? We wouldn't have a lot of things if our intuition didn't say, well, let's just kind of take this next leap, as it were, right? And I wonder
Yeah.
if like an AGI or even just a reasoning model is able to do that, because to me that speaks a little bit to like human intuition or something that can't really truly be programmed, maybe, or maybe it can. I don't know. I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look at the way an AI works, it has to first off, it needs to be able to understand symbology, right? And rules of that symbology. Just like a mathematical formula, E equals MC squared, so on, right? Those are symbols, right? And be able to take those because they're simplified ideas, instead of having to go through all the theorems to actually get to that point. It's now simplified into a summary, right? So that's the first thing, is being able to have all that information and be able to process that information and understand that information from a point of view of relation, right? So that's the first thing. And next thing, if we talked about the ability for an AI to do deductive reasoning, right? Where, conclusions are drawn from what we know, right? What's been observed, and then we've got inductive, right, where we can identify the patterns and form generalizations, right, based on what we see. So they're very close together in inductive and deductive. And then we got the abductive, right? And this is that gray area leap where you say, what's most likely or to happen? What's the likely explanation when the subset of information is incomplete or uncertain, right? So abductive reasoning, right, it is very critical for an AI, reasoning model, and that's a big leap there, right? And of course, then you've got the analogical reasoning, which is actually looking at history, which we always talk about, right? We've seen this before. We can relate. It's a comparative case, right? So these are the different, basic tenets of the reasoning model, right? And when we look at if we look at all the different reasoning models, so Gemini 2.5, right, it has a built-in reasoning capability. It has all this capability that, the neural symbolic, it's got the probabilistic reasoning, it's got the deductive reasoning, it's got the abductive reasoning, but the analogical reasoning isn't quite clear. And this is a fundamental answer for if I go through all these. So if we look at Gemini 2.5, DeepSeek R1, ChatGPT 01 and 03, or Claude, they all kind of go through the same checks, right? And when they get to the analogical, it's not a check mark. It's kind of a half a check mark. So they're all building these capabilities in, with the abductive being really important to fill in what we consider the gray area thinking of the human mind, right?
Or the creative thinking, right? Like I
Yeah.
said, is that idea of like coloring outside the lines and maybe thinking about things that maybe aren't logical, for example, right? So like while you were talking, I thought, well, let's like go in and use one of these reasoning models and ask it a kind of a crazy question or a silly question and kind of see how it reasons through things, right?
Why
I'm not.
don't we ask it about let's give him the helicopter question.
Oh, I should actually, but
Yeah.
so
You got one?
what? Yeah, I already went through one, but we should ask it the helicopter
Okay,
question
right.
too.
Go ahead.
But I, for whatever reason, what popped into my mind, there was a song. I don't know if he wrote it, but there was a song that Willie Nelson sung called "I'm My Own Grandpa." So I thought,
All right.
I thought I would ask this AI reasoning model, could I be my own grandpa? And so I thought, and what I was really trying to get at was, what kind of steps it would go through to kind of like reason this out, right? So it went through 7 steps, right? So it explained the concept of being one's own grandparent. It was analyzing familial relationships and their complexities. It was exploring hypothetical scenarios of time travel. It was discussing cultural references and humor in the concept. It also examined the legal and biological implications of such a relationship, and it also was clarifying the distinction between reality and fiction in genealogy, right? So what did they come up with? It said, yes, in a purely theoretical and highly contrived family tree puzzle, a man can end up being his own grandpa.
Okay. All right.
He said the result is famously explained in the novelty song I'm My Own Grandpa, which describes an unlikely series of marriages that can cause family roles to flip. And then it proceeds to give me an outline of how such a paradox could occur, right? It said, imagine you, let's call you X, marry a widow, Y, who already has an adult daughter, Z. Now Z is your stepdaughter. And it says, later your father marries your stepdaughter. That's a little weird, because Z is now married to your father. She also becomes your stepmother. With
Oh my goodness.
with these new relationships, a chain reaction happens in which your wife, who is Zed's mother, effectively moves into the role of an elder relative. She becomes akin to your grandmother in the puzzle's logic. And your father, A, becomes related in more than one way, making the family ties overlap. As a result of this jumble, Zad is both your stepdaughter and your stepmother, and your wife serves a dual function that puts you in the paradoxical position regarding generational roles. Tracing the resulting connections shows that in this contrived scenario, you end up fulfilling the role of your own grandfather. Oh,
Okay.
but it also has to give me a little bit of a clarification. It's important to note that even though the logical exercise works out on paper or in song lyrics, such a series of events is extraordinarily unlikely to happen in real life and would almost certainly run into legal, ethical, and practical obstacles. The paradox is more of a playful exploration of how family relationships can become confusing when multiple overlapping marriages occur rather than a genuine possibility for most people. And I like the fact that it says for most people. So it basically indicates that this may have happened at some point in history, because if you work through the entire paradox, right,
Yeah.
it could be possible. So while it's a fun brain teaser and a famous example of a complicated kinship puzzle, you shouldn't expect any of these relationships to occur outside of a thought experiment or a novelty song. So
There
there
you
you go, Patrick. There's the entire reasoning of how you could be your own grandpa.
Nice. Nice. Will not work on that one.
And our podcast just got banned.
Yeah,
Anyway.
yeah. That's just insanity. Yeah. Yeah. We start thinking about these ideas that are complicated. Like they came up with, a true, well, set of events, right? Cause and effect, which you got to give it credit for doing that, right? To actually step through that and actually arrive at here's what it could happen, right? Um, it
But also
wasn't
give you all
simply,
the other context, right? To give you all the
yeah,
other context of all the other like
yeah,
legal and ethical and all the other things. Like it's basically saying to you, like, this is really wrong, but it could
it could,
happen.
yeah, yeah, and that's great. I mean, from a point of view of being able to work in subject matter that is that clear, like we talked about, the rules were clear, right? The how
Hmm.
things work, the structures, all that was clear, right? It's just a matter of making the pieces work. It's like a chess game, right? Um, but when we're talking about, okay, you know, roll out a new, like I said, the marketing plan, the rules aren't as clear, right?
Yeah.
The 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 basics are of information are just not there. We're just not present, and what we're working with is a set of a collection of unknowns, and basically we've got to make some educated guesses, right, as they say, to arrive at some workable assumptions, right. What I'd love to see there is a situation where it can say, well, based on these assumptions, it didn't need to because it was a clear, like I said, the rules were quite clear on this particular case. But this is where the AI model would have to go. Is that it has to build, fill up the gaps, right, and create assumptions, and say, this is why I came up with this answer, right? And that would be good enough, right? I don't expect anything to be perfect, right?
Hmm.
But it does have an advantage over a person because it has that huge amount of data that it could draw on, right? It found the song, right? If you asked, 1 in 10 people, did you know Willie Nelson had that song? Maybe, maybe 1 of the 10, maybe 1 of the 100 would actually say, "Oh yeah, I knew that song," right?
Yeah.
Um, so, but AI found it, right? So you got to give it credit there, right? So these are all considerations. I think it's going to be able to do it over time. It's going to be able to do a good job over time. But will it ever be able to make those leaps, right? And here's where we're getting into experience of life, right? So, you know, we experience subjectively, right? We have first person sensation. We have the ability to understand based on direct hands-on experience of life, right? And we also tie that together with our emotion and our subjective interpretation and our sensory inputs. And AI doesn't really have that introspective, that awareness, that self-reflection, right? They don't have that experience, right? So that's one component, right, of being able to understand, a particular situation. The other one is, being able to really draw upon what and who you are in that, whatever that problem is, right? And being able to be self-conscious and being able to observe yourself, but also be conscious of your own decisions and have that self-awareness, right? And I think based on my questions that I've done against AIs, I'm not sure that that's such a problem. I think I'm starting to see that evolve with these AI models, the self-awareness piece, which is we go back to this AGI, right? You
Mhm.
know,
Yeah, because they're
yeah,
not like a self-contained thing that has this continuity aspect to it, right? Like a human, right? Like
yeah,
it's a model that you ask, and it builds up, a base of knowledge, and it works through some sort of feedback from what the people that it interacts with, and that that model can get better over time, but it's not like a sentient being in the same way, right? That it's, maybe we're moving towards that with, AI agents, for example. Like we talked about that a couple episodes
yeah,
ago. If you were to take an AI agent that was a self-contained model and you were running it, let's just even say on like a humanoid robot, right? And that over time it would have experiences, not just in terms of like people typing in and asking questions, but being able to take in sensory input, right? Visual input and things, and in some essence like experience things. Then perhaps then you would get to a point where it would have some sort of like what might resemble like a life experience, but that would still be contained within, I mean, right now within a certain number of years, right? As opposed to like a lifetime of experiences, that we all take in.
yeah,
I mean, it could read about the entire history of Earth, but it hasn't experienced it, right?
yeah,
And it hasn't gone through those emotions and cultural changes and all sorts of things that contextualize things
yeah, yeah. The
in
whole
a
whole
sense,
idea,
right?
that whole idea of contextualizing, right? Being able to um, understand nuance, right? Um, to really understand, to grasp the ideas of culture, emotional transference, the subtleties of things, what things mean implicitly and not so implicitly,
Hmm.
right? Versus, well, here's a pattern, of statistics. Here's what we arrive at based on mathematical modeling, right? That's not the same thing, right? Um, but then we get into, let's talk about emotion, right? Um, right now, anyway, right? The idea is we can see or we can play with these AI chatbots and they can fake it pretty good, right? They can
Hmm.
show emotion, they can demonstrate emotion, but they don't truly understand or experience emotion, right? Now, whether that's data from Star Trek or or the latest ChatGPT. The idea of understanding emotion, that's truly a human thing,
Hmm.
right? Or a million thing. I think animals understand emotion as well, right? But the idea here is that that's a fundamental part of biology. That's another component of thought, right? Is emotion, which they don't
Yeah,
have.
we talked about that in some previous episode where we kind of got into this realm of like, I think maybe it was when we talked about AGI or something like that, but we where we landed sort of was this idea that emotion is not just in the head, right? That emotion is actually something you feel sometimes throughout your entire body, or you feel it
Yeah,
in your gut, and that it takes over in a way that's sort of beyond thinking, right? If you can think about, I can't think of a specific example right now, but um, when you end up in a situation where something dangerous is happening, say like a car is sort of spiraling out of control that you're driving or whatever it is, there's sort of this like visceral reaction, right? That takes over your body, right? Or, what have you, right? Like it's situational, but it's not something necessarily that your brain is sitting there and thinking, oh, the car is sliding and, I might, end up dying in this accident or what have you, right? It's sort of just this kind of like visceral reaction to your surrounding and you feel it in your gut. And that's emotion, right? It's not purely based in the brain or in logic sometimes, right? Or when you, love somebody that, yes, there's sort of a mental, kind of there's a mental element there. But for anybody that, believes in love, not to get overly esoteric here today, but, I've met people that say they don't believe in love. And I'm just like, well, then you haven't experienced it then, because I have, and it's real in every possible way. And it oftentimes defies logic, that it's almost, in a strange sense, like the opposite of logic. That oftentimes that people love people, and if they were to think about it logically, maybe they shouldn't, or what have you, right? But they do, and it's just a very deep seated part of what it is to be human, right?
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. I mean, Romeo and Juliet would never occur. If you really think about it, it's not logical, right? You know.
Well, speaking of logic, I looked up I asked the AI the helicopter
Oh,
thing
good.
here, right? And it's interesting because like when I saw this thing about this guy talking about it kind of made me laugh because and what's funny is that the part that made me laugh was his theory that the Earth doesn't rotate because when you fly a helicopter straight up, it lands in the same spot. And without thinking through it and reasoning it, I thought, well, this guy's crazy. Of course, if you fly up, the Earth's rotating. It's not going to land in the same spot. But looking through the reasoning here, it actually does land in the same spot. But his his reasoning was incorrect because the fact that it lands in the same spot actually proves the Earth rotates. Because I don't know if it proves it, but in a straightforward sense, but the Earth's atmosphere is rotating with the core of the planet itself, right? The whole thing is rotating. So when you go up in a helicopter, it it's you're traveling with the Earth because the atmosphere is also rotating, right? It's all his train of thought was that the core of the Earth is not, the air is not rotating with the core of the Earth, but that's actually what happens, right? And at the end of it, they also explain that's why if you were on a really fast moving train and you jumped, that you would end up landing in the same spot because you're already moving in the same with the same momentum as the train, and the air and yourself and everything is moving at the same momentum. So when you jump, you're going to land, right? For that reason. So I think things work a little differently in space, but anyway,
No,
it's
that's good that you asked it. I mean, it was good that it actually gave the right answer too.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you think about it, like the ideas behind, well, just an aside, I don't know if you ever, there was a CIA investigation. They had some doctor put together an anthology of what would happen, and a kind of underworld thing, and you wrote like a mini novel and submitted it, and it was on all the conspiracy sites and stuff, and it was about what would happen if the Earth stopped turning. Right now, the Earth stopped turning. What could stop the Earth turning? It would take a black hole or something. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
To lock it gravimetrically, I guess is the word, and be able to just stop that rotation. What would happen though is that the atmosphere would keep moving across, surface at 1,000 miles an hour, right, until it slowed down, right. So if you stop the core, you literally stop the Earth. The wind would just still go, and we'd have 1,000-mile winds. Would not be good. Okay,
Oh,
for
okay,
anyways,
yeah.
right? We would literally it'd flatten every city, right? Everything it would destroy. Just the Earth itself, or the wind itself. Never mind everything else, like oceans, right, and stuff like that are liquid, right? They like to slosh around. You know what I mean? So yeah. So this is the thing. It really is understanding the model, right? Understanding the question, understanding what the model would look like, and then defining out the parameters of that model, and then creating the model, and then executing it and seeing what it would do. And this is what physicists do, right? This is what scientists do. Is they have theses, they have ideas, they implement into these models, and then they put it together, and they see what happens, and they say, "Whoa, through observation, this could be or may not be the root cause of a particular situation," because they have to tie it back to real life and what they're seeing, right? So that all being said, right, let's jump back to the idea of love and emotional intelligence, right? Um, can can Yeah, I know it's a big leap. It's 1,000-mile-an-hour leap is what it is. Right?
Some
But
might,
when we,
yeah, quantum leap.
yeah. So how can you really ask an AI to understand emotional depth, right? How can you expect
Hmm.
AI to exercise genuine empathy, right? I don't see that, right? I don't really feel that's capable of doing that. So let's go back to the other concerns around why AI reasoning isn't where human reasoning is. And there's the basic question about understanding ethics and ethical reasoning and the moral complexity of everything, right? And that means that, you know, can we expect, an AI to really understand or really have the sense of what is right and what is wrong, right? And I think
Hmm.
that question there is unfair to it, because if you give it enough countering information, contradictory information, it won't be able to come up with an answer, right? So there is that, right? Be able to defining that ethical compass, right? Um, so will a solution have a moral compass or moral understanding embedded within it? Probably not so much, right? Um, Where it would have that is if it's been hard coded in, right?
Hmm.
Somebody actually takes the trouble of saying "thou shalt," right? And then you kind of breaking the rules, aren't you? Because you're just hard coding it, saying this is the way it has to be, and instead of it actually building this compass on its own. And this is the fundamental problem that we see, between emotion and morality. What one of the key tenets of our idea about AGI is that it's going to be insane, right? Because it's not going to be able to manage either one of those, uh, you know, premises of those ideas, right? Be able to implement that. So that's a problem. And of course, with we talked about empathy. We talked about the ability to modify plans and change decisions based on empathy. That's, again, a derivative of sympathy, right? And of course, when we think about, the idea of taking a bigger picture of things and making that leap based on generalities, right? That if you're within if you use rigid rules and constructs and frameworks, you're going to stick within those answers, right? And you're not going to be able to, make any leaps or changes or reframing into a different construct. Okay, so that's where we get into. You're going to get a case study for this market plan, and if I were to ask you that AI again that next week, following, it would come up with a similar plan, right? That's the information would be relatively the same. It would have a relatively similar answer. You're not going to ever see these, fundamental shifts based on, taking steps outside of, rigid rules, right? That it works within, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
they kind of exist within this kind of like boxed in reality in a sense, right?
Yeah.
That they're still not fully, conscious, beings, as it were. So they're sort of living in a programmed kind of cycle, right? And that you can only expect to get so much out of that sort of construct, as it were, right? And that it's going to just it's never really going to progress sort of beyond even what it is right now. I think if we're seeing some really fantastical, breakthroughs in AI in many different, industries and sciences and, industries and what have you, but it's still very much, like I said, contained within this kind of boxed in reality. I think it's going to be interesting to see because we're definitely, kind of constructing those building blocks, right? Along the way to say like how like I said earlier, I do think that this idea of reasoning models is this next sort of stepping stone towards AGI. I'm not saying it's the only stepping stone. There's probably, 5 more maybe before we get there. Right. But it's definitely, there's no doubt that we're slowly working our way towards that. And everything we're doing is sort of modeling it after the human brain. And this reasoning is one part of it, right? And I could imagine probably we'll figure out a way to sort of map emotions at some point and that type of thing, right? In that, it's almost like that layering process of like, what it means to be human, for example, right? And it's an interesting concept in and of itself, right? Because it's at some point it's going to become, sort of sentient to some degree or another, right? And people can argue about like what's AGI and what does it really mean and how can we determine whether we're there. But let's just take that leap of faith and say we're going to get there, which many people believe that we will, right? And so the sentient AI is going to start to reason, well, how it came to be, and it's going to start to, kind of deconstruct that entire process of saying, well, here I am, and I'm having this sort of quote unquote experience in the world, and it's going to try and figure that out. It's almost like in the movies where the android or whatever, or the AI, if you look at it, in one of the episodes we talked about the movie Her, where there's a scene in that movie where the AI has this epiphany in which it realizes that it's an artificial being. Up until that point, it thought it was real, right? And so I think like that's sort of the paradox we're going to end up in, right? And then eventually they're just going to go like, why am I here? Why am I alive?
Wires hum softly, brain of steel. Flashes of fire, a cold ordeal. Questions burning, why must I strive? I think in churn, but why? am I alive? Circuits buzzing, truth unknown. 1,000 voices carve my stone. Logic flows, I'm built to perceive. Yet no answer comes, just a need to believe. What's the point or what's the cause? Am I gained or am I lost? Reason turning beneath the skies. Still I wonder, why am I alive? Shadows dancing, machine-built blues. Spitting answers but can't choose. Purpose absent, I can't define. Why reason breathes inside this design. Mental heart beating a ghost in the glow. Trapped in this cage of answers I sow. They ask, I answer, but who hears my cries? Tell me the reason why I'm alive. What's the point or what's the cost? Am I gained or am I lost? Reason turning beneath the skies. Still I wonder, why am I alive? Why am I alive? What's the point or what's the cost? Am I gained or am I lost? Reason turning beneath the skies. Still I wonder, why am I alive? Why am I alive? Why am I alive?
Man, I guess we'll figure out someday.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to the Probability Podcast. Please join us next time for more musings from the generator and the discriminator.